Hello everyone and welcome to episode 63 of the Layton Fitness podcast. Now in today's episode I'm going to give you some tips on how to consistently hit your daily calorie and macronutrient targets. Now I don't really want to go into depth of the reasons why you should be tracking these key important numbers. If you look back at some of my previous podcast episodes, especially some of the earliest podcasts, episode 1 to 10, you should find a couple of episodes which will explain why it's critical you should be tracking these numbers. But this episode is more specifically tips on how to consistently meet these, because it can be a tricky process. If you're going from not tracking anything to tracking your calories and macronutrients, it does take some time getting used to. It can be a little bit stressful, can be a little bit overwhelming, so hopefully the tips included within this podcast are really going to dramatically help you. Now firstly, you need to actually have some daily calorie and macronutrient targets to actually track. So to do this, if you go to my website, Layton, Layton fitness.co.uk, there's a tab at the top of the page called free ebook, and I've actually got a free ebook which teaches you how to set your targets for fat loss or muscle gain, and also how to make changes subject to your progress. Secondly, I would download the application called iifym on your smartphone. So this is a free application. The only thing I would say is when you initially sign up, MyFitnessPal will try and give you some generic figures to start using. Ignore that and simply plug in the targets you've calculated from my free ebook. So plug those into MyFitnessPal, and then you're simply using MyFitnessPal as a tool to add your foods as the day goes along, and to basically give you a clear indication of where you are on the day, i.e. how many calories and macronutrients you've got left to consume to actually meet your daily targets. MyFitnessPal is a great tool, with the caveat you don't use their generic figures because protein is way too low. They basically have it set up on government guidelines which is not tailored to a trained individual, someone performing weight training, etc. So just keep that in mind. Now, one key tip I want to build the foundation of this episode upon, and this is something that I personally do, and it's something that a lot of my clients do, and something I've taught to them, and I personally think it makes the process that much less stressful just because you're not having to really nitpick on every meal. And that tip is basically this: you're really focusing on grazing on foods throughout the day, you're adding the foods as you go along onto MyFitnessPal, but you're not really considering exactly what's in the meal. So for example, if you're consuming 4 meals per day, using this tactic, you're not dividing your daily calorie, carbohydrate, protein, fat intake by 4 and then evenly consuming those 4 meals to meet your daily target. This strategy is more about grazing on foods during the day, and then you're using that last meal of the day to meet your daily targets. So really that last meal is when you actually physically work out exactly what you need to meet your daily protein, carbohydrate, fat and calorie targets. Now this doesn't mean you're just eating whatever you want throughout the day. Obviously you have a rough idea of what you're consuming, but the key thing is because you're adding it to MyFitnessPal, that last meal of the day you should be able to look on MyFitnessPal and think, what do I have left to meet my protein target? What do I have left to meet my carbohydrate and fat and calorie targets? And this really just makes it much more simple because you're not having to, as I said, nitpick on every single meal. You're more thinking, making sure you're meeting your daily targets by the end of the day, but you're just really calculating and having to think about it consciously for that final meal. And what I often like to do is actually have my final dinner meal, and then I'll have one mini snack, and that snack is the last meal of the day to basically make up for the net difference of any of these targets. And the way to do this, I actually saw a really good video from someone I know quite well personally, Gordon Greenhorn. He's another online coach, and he had a really good video on his Facebook page, and he said similar things really. And one of the points he was making is having a short list of foods that are mainly just consuming one macronutrient, and you can use these foods at the end of the day to meet your daily target. So for example, if you were, say, 40 grams short of protein at the end of the day, you've already had your dinner meal, you could easily use, for example, whey protein to make up the net difference. Let's say, for example, you're 50 grams short of carbohydrates after you've had your dinner meal. You can easily use things like fruit are ideal because they're very high in carbohydrates, pretty much zero protein and fat. Therefore, you can use that. So, for example, you can have, some blueberries, bananas, apples, etc. to meet that target. Likewise, for fat, you could use things like oils or nut butters or nuts. So usually there's a small amount of carbohydrates within nuts, but mainly fat. And again, the same principle, using those foods to meet the net difference for that particular target. So hopefully that makes sense. So you've got two strategies here. One, saving that last meal of the day to meet your daily targets, and two, having single macronutrient foods to make up the net difference for each macronutrient. So hopefully that makes sense. Some good examples like whey protein for protein, dairy, so you can have Greek yogurt or low-fat yogurt, anything like that will be a good tool for the protein source, and even any meats and fish on their own would be absolutely perfect. It's very high in protein, very little carbs and fats. For carbohydrates, I would personally like to use fruits, things like rice cakes would be ideal because again, very high carbohydrates and very low in proteins and fats. And then fats, nut butters, nuts, oils, anything like that would be ideal to make up your fat target. So focus on trying to have a selection of these foods within your kitchen that you can easily call upon at the last meal of the day to make up the net difference for any of those targets. However, it's important to note that this strategy isn't good for some people. Some people prefer the more structured approach. Some people prefer, say for example, if they're having 4 meals a day and they have the exact same macronutrients in each 4 meals to meet their daily targets. If that's you, that's absolutely fine. Which just takes a little bit more preparation time, so you might have to prep all your meals first thing in the morning or the night before. Both strategies work, but for most people, I think saving a lot of their food and take the last meal of the day, that typically is when most people are more hungry. Therefore, it's nice to have a larger meal in the evening, but both strategies work. Another point I want to make is just be cautious when you work out your calories and macronutrients and then you start tracking them in real life, is sometimes the macros and the calories don't match up perfectly. And there's a really good article from Lyle McDonald on his site, and basically what happens is the food companies are allowed to round their targets. So for example, if a food contains say 20.4 grams of protein, they're actually allowed to round that to 20 grams on the packet. And this doesn't seem a big difference on its own, but imagine every single food there could be small discrepancies, small roundings up and down. At the end of the day, you can see why there can be discrepancies between your total macros and the actual calorie figures. My answer is just don't panic. Just realise that there's going to be some error here and just focus on just meeting the targets and just appreciate there might be a small error, but it's not going to make a big deal, not going to make a big difference in the grand scheme of things. Now, some tips for fat loss. When your calories are lower, again, I like to use that strategy of saving calories later in the day, typically that's when you're more hungry, and this is a great tool because if you're on lower calories, you're dieting for a period of time, having more food in the evening really helps to help prevent any hunger and cravings. Additionally, focus more on food volume, i.e. focus on consuming lots of fibrous vegetables. The reason why this is high in fibre, which helps keep you fuller for longer, but also the amount of calories per volume of food is so low, you can eat a lot of vegetables and not consume that many calories. And this really helps both psychologically and also from a fibre perspective, is this can help you keep you fuller for longer, but also psychologically you feel like you're eating more than you actually are. So that's another great tool. Lots of fibre, fibrous vegetables, saving a lot of the calories later in the day can really help within the fat loss phase for adherence and helping with any hunger issues. Within a muscle gaining phase, things are slightly different because the trickiest part is actually consuming enough calories. It can be, and it's been a problem for me personally and a lot of my other clients, is just being able to meet the targets because you feel like you're not hungry because you're eating all the time. It feels like almost a full-time job eating. And the trickiest macronutrient to eat would be carbohydrate. Protein and fat will stay somewhat constant, or protein definitely, fat will change to a degree, but carbohydrates is the main macronutrient that will be going up over time, and that can be a tricky target to meet, especially if you're into the 4, 5, potentially 600 grams of carbohydrates per day for some individuals. Some tips for this would actually be to use the opposite approach in terms of focusing on less fibrous carbohydrate sources at times to help meet that total carbohydrate figure. I also like to use bananas a lot when I'm in a bulking phase, just because it contains approximately 23 grams of carbohydrates, but very easy to consume, and you tend not to feel that full after having that. In addition to things like low-fat cereals can be a great tool because they're easy to get in a lot of carbohydrates within one single meal. Things like white rice can be a good tool, a little bit less fibre than some of the other rice sources, and that helps you get in the absolute carbohydrates you need for building muscle. So hopefully you found this useful. Hopefully this has provided some practical applications to help you meet your calorie macronutrient targets. If you're still yet to download that free ebook, if you go to James Layton, Layton Fitness.co.uk, and download it immediately. Thanks guys, I'll speak to you next week. Take care.